afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to welcome you to our 2023 Zeman Lecture. For those of you watching online, for those of you in the classroom here with us today, a very warm welcome. I'd like to welcome you especially on behalf of the Acadia Centre for Baptist and Anabaptist Studies, which is a joint initiative of Acadia Divinity College and the Vaughan Memorial Library of Acadia University. I extend greetings also from our Administrative Committee Chair, Dr. Caroline Jansen, who is here with us this afternoon. The mission of our center is to encourage and facilitate studies in the field of Baptist and Anabaptist history and thought. And you can find out more at acbas.acadiau.ca. This afternoon, we do look forward to our 2023 Zeman Lecture featuring Dr. Nina Schroeder-van Schip from the Free University of Amsterdam. The Zeman Lectures were established in 2009 in memory of Dr. Jarold K. He was born in Czechoslovakia in 1926 and came to Canada as a student in 1948. He earned degrees from Charles University, Knox College, and the University of Zurich. During his years of study in Toronto, he became a Baptist and an ordained minister. Zeman served as a pastor to Czech immigrants and worked with the Baptist Convention of Ontario and Quebec. And he served as the first professor of church history at Acadia Divinity College from 1968 until 1991. Many of you may have fond memories of his time here. He was influential in this position in publishing and promoting the study of Baptist and Anabaptist history in Canada. In fact, Martin Marty once called him the best church historian in North America. He received honorary Doctor of Divinity degrees from McMaster University and Acadia University, and the Comenius Medal from the University of Prague. And he also served as president of the Baptist Federation of Canada. Dr. Zeman helped found the Acadia Centre for Baptist and Anabaptist Studies in 1991. He retired in the same year and passed away in 2000. And so every 2 years, we hold the Zeman Lectures in memory of Dr. Zeman. And featured speakers bring expertise in various areas of Anabaptist studies. So I'm pleased to tell you today more about our Zeman lecturer. Dr. Nina Schroeder-van Schip is an art historian and postdoctoral researcher at the Faculty of Religion and Theology at the Free University of Amsterdam. She's conducting interdisciplinary research on Dutch Mennonite life, representation, and artistic engagement in the early modern period. In her doctoral research, she investigated the representations of early Anabaptism in Dutch art. Her current research interests include Dutch Golden Age painting, early modern print history, and Mennonite social networks within the Dutch art marketplace. She's on the planning committee of the Amsterdam Center for the History and Heritage of Protestantism, and she's a board member of the Doopsesende Historische Kring Board. She's also the coordinator of the undergraduate minor, Peace Theology and Anabaptist Mennonite Traditions. Dr. Schroeder-van Schip, we look forward to hearing you speak on Mennonites and the Dutch art world, faith and visual culture in the Dutch Republic. I'd like to thank you all for being here and let you know that after the lecture, we will have time for questions. If you're in person, you may raise your hand with a question. If you're on Zoom, there's a Q&A place that you can submit your questions anytime, and we will ask those of our lecturer after the lecture. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon and greetings from the Netherlands. I'm so pleased to be here virtually at Acadia Centre for Baptist and Anabaptist Studies. Many thanks to Professor Melody Maxwell and to all of those who were involved in organizing the Zeman Lecture for inviting me to speak this year. The research that I'll be sharing today is primarily material that I've been pulling together within the framework of a recent grant from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada for my book project titled Mennonites and Art in the Dutch Republic, Church, Home, and Art Marketplace, which is now accepted with Pandora Press. So if you like the talk, you can read more about it soon in book format. For the next hour, we will explore the theological and sociocultural basis for Dutch Mennonite views on art in the early modern period, and trace key contexts of Mennonite involvements as patrons and as artists in the Dutch art world. The topic of Mennonitism and arts more broadly is increasingly a point of conversation. The topic of Mennonitism and arts more broadly is increasingly a point of conversation in lay and scholarly Mennonite circles, Heritage sites showcase traditional craft forms such as quilting and floor painting done by rural Mennonite groups in North America at places like the Mennonite Heritage Village in Steinbach. And there's a growing public interest in contemporary urban Mennonite writers and artists in North America, spurred on by conferences like Mennonites Writing and exhibition opportunities in art galleries and heritage centers within cities that have large Mennonite populations. Over the past decades in academia, including art history and Mennonite history, there have also been frequent calls for more in-depth study of Mennonite relationships to fine art. The case of Mennonitism and art in the Dutch Republic is identified by several scholars as a natural place to start, since it's the earliest historical context of prolonged, productive Mennonite involvement in art production. In our time this afternoon, I want to do 5 things. I'll offer a lay of the land regarding the Mennonite milieu and artistic milieu of the early modern period, and then we'll look more closely at some stumbling blocks and breakthroughs in the methods of studying this subject, and then look at the context of church, home, and art marketplace more closely. I want to touch on the theological and practical reasons for visual characteristics of the plain Mennonite hidden church interiors, explore the role of art in Mennonite homes, and look at the art marketplace networks that included Mennonites. The Dutch Mennonites were a marginalized and persecuted religious minority in the 16th century, but their social experience shifted dramatically by the turn of the 17th century with the establishment of the Dutch Republic. Dutch Reformed citizens maintained civic and religious dominance through this Republic era, but Mennonites, like the Lutherans, Remonstrants, Catholics, and Jews, could live and worship without any troubles so long as their worship buildings were hidden from street view. Though some opportunities were closed to them, networks of Mennonites quickly succeeded in trade, medical professions, publishing, and the arts. As a result, many of them found their place among the Dutch cultural and intellectual elite. While the Dutch Mennonite churches were devoid of images on theological grounds, art was generally a welcomed part of home and business life. There were dozens of successful early Mennonite artists. And so now, buckle up for a whirlwind spin through a whole lot of art examples. I promise I'll come back to some of these later in the talk. My intention now is simply to immerse you in the art and show you the immense scope of the topic at hand. Here we go. Some examples include the art theorist Carl van Mander, court painter Michiel van Mierveld, Mennonite minister, biblical history painter, and art dealer Lambert Jacobzoon, who was also in business with Rembrandt's art dealer, the Waterlander Mennonite Hendrik Ellenberg. Members of the Rousdale family of landscape painters, Vanitas painter and still life painter Vincent Laurens van der Winne, and many subsequent generations of that family, and inventor and cityscape painter Jan van der Heyden, as well as prolific illustrator Jan Luyken. Oh, here are the slides here in the correct order. Apologies for that. Of course, he's well known for being the illustrator of the 1685 Martyr's Mirror. It's noteworthy that all 3 of the biggest names in art theory and art biography writing, Van Mander already named, but also Samuel van Hoogstraten and Arnold Houbraken, came from Mennonite milieus. Still other examples of artists and networks touch upon less well-known painters, paper cutters, draftsmen, printmakers, and other kinds of artists. These are all artists who received less attention in art historical consideration, but offer fascinating insights into aspects of Mennonite involvement in fine art. My tally at the moment places the number of artists who were active Mennonite members or came from Mennonite homes at more than 90. These were mainly men, but also some women, often from multi-generational families of artists. Several were active in their churches, some as deacons, like Jan van der Heyden, who was a deacon in the Flemish church by Lam, the present-day Singelkerk, or 1 or 2 were even ministers, like Lambert Jacobzoon in the Waterlander Church in Leeuwarden, and Peter Cornelis van Soest, a marine painter, and also a minister in the old Flemish Mennonite church tradition. Some other artists chose to be baptized Mennonite, but eventually switched to other churches, as was Samuel van Hoogstraten and Arnold Houbraken from Dordrecht, who eventually moved to the Reformed Church after marriage to Reformed wives. Still others, like Rembrandt pupil Govert Flink and his peer Jacob Bakker, both history painters and portraitists, grew up Mennonite and chose to get baptized with the Remonstrant Church later on. It was not uncommon for affiliations to differ within families. For example, in the famous Rousdale family of landscape painters, Most were Mennonite, while Jacob Rousdale eventually converted to the Reformed Church 2 years after moving from Haarlem to Amsterdam in 1655. There were many notable art patrons among the Mennonites as well. Like their neighbors of other faiths, those who could afford it collected art. Collections are especially notable among networks of well-to-do merchant families, for instance, the families Leeuw, de Klerk, Blok, de Neufville, Van Eken, de Vlinis, Van Lennep, Kops, among several others. Within these families, there was often intermarriage, which allowed for consolidation of wealth over generations and more art collecting. As we will see, art collecting was a part of elite erudite culture of the day, but art content in most genres also had ties to theological ways of looking at and understanding the world. Some smaller conservative Mennonite groups, like the Groninger Oude Vlamingen and the Jan Jacobsgezinde, produced few or no artists and prohibited art collection. The Groninger Oude Vlamingen, for instance, set forth a strict set of prescriptions on dress, home decor, and art in a list of 20 regulations established in 1659. However, this was the exception and not the rule among Dutch Mennonites. By all accounts, the case studies of Dutch Mennonite involvement in art production, patronage, and collection stand out within the larger scope of Mennonite history and offer a picture of Mennonite pious living which includes fine art, a combination which stands in contrast to many of our assumptions about Mennonite theological positions on art, shaped by narratives of Mennonite rural agrarian colonies and the context of traditionally minded communities where art, ornamentation, and portraiture were and sometimes still are frowned upon and seen to go against values of humility, simplicity, and the biblical injunction against graven images. As with any topic, by pushing ahead with these themes, we stand on the shoulders of giants. There have been many interesting articles and exhibitions in the Netherlands that deal with artists and patrons who are Mennonites, though the authors and curators working with these histories of these individuals are rarely doing so with the topic of Mennonitism as one of the focal points. In the 1990s, Piet Visser, who's been a champion and pioneer in research on Dutch Mennonite cultural heritage with a focus on Mennonites' literary contributions, noted that more substantive research on cultural heritage is a project which cannot be answered by traditional church history, but demands interdisciplinary approaches. Furthermore, he noted two directions for research which could take off fruitfully. First, to look at these contributions in their own right for understanding the place, assimilation, and contribution of Mennonites within the Dutch mainstream society. And secondly, for understanding, as I quote, the historical significance of this phenomenon in light of an initially entirely opposite development among Mennonites elsewhere in the world, but which now, almost 3 centuries later, has become a somewhat comparable process of assimilation, at least in the cases of large numbers of urban Mennonites. I believe that both of these angles are relevant and should be of interest for the field of Mennonite studies, not only in the Netherlands, but in places like Canada and elsewhere, where there's a significant population of Mennonites who trace their roots from the Low Countries through to Poland and Prussia, to Imperial Russia, and finally to North America. However, Mennonite studies and intellectual history research since the 90s by the likes of Visser and by Gary Waite, Michael Drieger, and Mary Sprunger, among others, have shown that Mennonites not only succeeded in economy and arts because they assimilated and therefore benefited from Dutch cultural innovations, but rather contributed to shaping this very milieu of innovation as people who were indigenous to this culture and part of the fabric of Dutch society. Despite their minority status and comparably small population, only 3 to 7% of Amsterdam's population, for instance, they were to be found among household names of literary, artistic, engineering, medical, and mercantile innovation of the era. Guild portraits and other portrait prints intended for wide circulation within the tradition of portraits of great men all stand as documents showing that these individuals held respected places in society. Guild and board portraits, like the ones you see here, documented the members of these groups and hung in semi-public spaces like guild halls, where they offered gravitas and preserved the likeness of these members for posterity. Portraits in print, in their turn, were only made when artists and publishers assumed there would be profit to be made due to substantial interest in the sitter as a significant thinker, religious leader, politician, or artist. Mennonites find their place in both of these medias and genres. Here in these two examples, you can see, second from the left in the painting by Rembrandt, is a Mennonite, and also in the Surgeons Guild here, second from the left. Also worthy of note are creative dissenting thinkers at the peripheries of orthodoxy who pushed theological and philosophical thinking in directions which supported early Enlightenment ideals of the later 17th and 18th centuries. Here, even some artists were among those circles of dissident thinkers. For instance, David Joris, a 16th century glass painter turned Anabaptist, then spiritualist, was important in shaping subsequent spiritualizing approaches to Mennonitism, which flourished in several of the Mennonite groups of the 17th century and beyond. Dordrecht artist and art biographer Arnold Houbraken, a Flemish Mennonite turned Reformed and ultimately unorthodox freethinker, wrote treatises blending religion, art, and philosophy, which landed him in trouble with the Reformed consistory. While Mennonites were making art and buying art to a degree that warrants its identification as an exceptional case study, as Visser has recently argued in the case of early Mennonite literature, and Magdalena Redekop has explored more broadly in her look at present-day Mennonite writers and artists and musicians in Canada, we must be very careful about how we understand and use terminology like Mennonite art, as opposed to art made by Mennonites. For visual art, I would argue, and will show today, that while there are some contexts of art production that use that had distinct Mennonite devotional or theological characteristics, like illustration commissioned for selected didactic or devotional illustrated books, in most cases, the latter category, art made by Mennonites, is the appropriate way of understanding art production and consumption among the Dutch Mennonites. To get a full picture of the scope of Mennonite involvement and representation in art, it's important to look at both art for and about Mennonites, as well as the bulk of production, which simply clarifies the degree and kinds of contributions that these artists were making to the field in this time period, which has often been considered a golden age of art. This approach to looking at kinship networks and contributions as a way to understand artists and patrons who were Mennonite aligns with the accepted and fruitful shifts in art historical methodology with relation to fine art and Dutch religious milieu. Within art historical study, significant interest in the question of Mennonites in art was raised especially in the mid-20th century, when selected historians and art historians got wind of the possibility that Rembrandt might be a Mennonite on the basis of a mistaken early modern Italian biography, evidence of portrait commissions from Mennonites, and a sense of Rembrandt's sympathetic attention to biblical nuance in his history painting, and the hypothesis that some of these paintings, for instance, themes like the baptism of the eunuch, might be more meaningful to Mennonites. In the second half of the 20th century, art historians became disillusioned with confessional approaches like this, as literature flourished from writers of various denominational corners, claiming Rembrandt, or trying to, for all sorts of different creeds in this kind of way. Harold S. Bender's Mennonite Quarterly Review article on Mennonites and art emerged in this scholarly milieu, and therefore is in need of some updates and corrections to details on artists, networks, and ways of understanding religious affiliation in relation to artists' careers in the Dutch art world. And it also misses many of the more recent archival findings that have revealed other artists who were Mennonite. Nevertheless, this overview of the theme over a 500-year period also worked into the present-day Gamio article on the subject, does raise attention to the unique nature of the Dutch context for this topic. And I think it's important that it highlights this was a very unique context in comparison to the often more insular, agrarian and rural context of Mennonite settlement, where art was frequently viewed with suspicion and seen as a break from Mennonite values of simplicity and humility, or the biblical commandment, again, about idolatry. In the 1990s in art history literature, Volker Manut and others studying Rembrandt and his network shifted the tide of research on biblical history imagery and the study of iconography to emphasize instead the crucial point that the Dutch Republic was a context in which artists of many different denominations worked across religious boundaries for the sake of business and good art, and they produced artwork aimed to appeal to the largest possible audience. In a Dutch context, this meant that much of the art had a Christian overtone that could appeal to a broadly Christian public. At this time, all Christian groups valued Bible stories and other genres that were imbued with religious overtones, and that couldn't fail to escape viewers in this confessional era. This shift opened the way for approaches like those of Stephanie Dickey, Frans Grijzenhout, and Ruud Lambour, which have moved away from iconographical analysis and focused more on networks, context for commission, and archival evidence from probate inventories and auction records to support a picture of artists' careers, patrons' collection practices, and how these may or may not have related to church membership and art involvements. With regard to Rembrandt, there is no clear evidence of his religious membership in any one church, though he had the most concrete familial ties with the Dutch Reformed Church. His wife Saskia Ellenberg was from the Dutch Reformed branch of the family, and later his mistress Hendrikje Stoffels was likewise Reformed, and his children were baptized as infants in the Reformed Church. Many in the Dutch Republic, especially in the early decades, were considered liefhebbers and refrained from formally joining any one church. So the absence of membership in this case is far from irregular. Professionally and socially, Rembrandt maintained patronage connections with networks among Mennonites, Jewish, Reformed, Catholic, and Remonstrant circles. He painted their portraits and produced history paintings that were collected by members from all of these groups. With a shift towards study of kinship networks, Rembrandt is no less interesting for the study of Mennonites and art, since his network of Mennonite patrons was robust, as was his network of pupils and fellow artists who worked with him. So what I show you here is simply a little mind map I put together, which shows different Mennonite artists and people who were connected with him. Everyone in the green is a Mennonite artist or from a Mennonite family. After his move from Leiden to Amsterdam in 1631, Rembrandt soon moved into the house of the Waterlander art dealer Hendrik Ellenberg and ran his studio for a span of several years. Mennonites naturally formed a part of the patronage base for Ellenberg, and this is well documented in portraits that Rembrandt painted of them. One example is the portrait of successful merchant Martin Marty. As you can see, he is dressed in seemingly simple black with a plain collar, typical of Mennonite dress in the first half of the 17th century. But the fine beaver hat and cloth itself were undoubtedly of high quality. As the Dutch Reformed minister Jacobus Chuglandis noted once, the menist fluweel, velvet, and menist laken, cloth, might be simple in color, but were of the richest quality. He would have sat for Rembrandt at least a few times in the studio. As was common, this sitting offered patrons the chance to see other artworks available for purchase by the artist. Drawing upon Bredius and the Rembrandt corpus, Jaap van der Veen posits that this is how the Loten family came to own Rembrandt's large historiated trony of a man in historiated dress, since it was later found in the possession of his grandson. The network that Rembrandt fell into, linking the Waterlander Mennonites Ellenberg, Lambert Jacobs, Culvert Flink, and Jacob Adrians Bakker, is also noteworthy. As Arnold Houbraken writes, in his Schouwburg, a big collection of artist biographies, Flink's parents in Kleve weren't keen to have their son take on the artist's profession, but when Jacobzoon came on a preaching tour in the region, they were convinced of his good character and permitted their son to go and study with him in Leeuwarden. There, he met Jacob Bakker, an artist from a Mennonite baking family, who was also apprenticing with Jacobzoon, the minister and art dealer and artist. The two young artists moved together from there to Amsterdam, where Jacob worked as an artist on his own and Flink took on further instruction from Rembrandt. Jacobs was also involved in art trade with Ellenberg, making the connection between studios logical. Flink, after Rembrandt's departure from Ellenberg's, took over as the head of the studio. Though Flink eventually left the Mennonites religiously, his early patronage in Amsterdam was significantly bolstered by commissions from the Leeuw family, members from among his Waterlander Mennonite relatives in the area. Flink's experiences offer just one example that show how kinship networks and religious bonds could play a big role in an artist's life trajectory. Guided by the wisdom that we should think of most art we are looking at here as art made by Mennonites rather than Mennonite art, we can also carefully look to see where and how this art nonetheless offers distinct helpful information about individual and collective Mennonite socio-theological context and experience in Dutch Republic life. Important points emerge here for the context of church and devotional life, the home and aspects of collecting context, and certain relationships, collaborations, and final products made within the artist's atelier. So we'll turn now to think about the church and devotional life. In the Dutch Republic, by the 17th century, there were several branches of Mennonites or Doopsgezinden including the Old and Young Flemish, the Old and Young Frisians, the Waterlanders, High Germans, and several other smaller splinter groups. These ranged from extremely theologically orthodox and socially conservative groups to networks that were deeply entrenched in spiritualism, collegiantism, and impulses of early Enlightenment thinking. There are fascinating examples of Mennonites from most of these different branches who shaped and were shaped by the vibrant Dutch art world of the early modern period. However, all of these groups refrained from including art in their worship spaces. This is linked to historical developments in the 16th century image debates and also to ongoing theology and circumstance of 17th century Republic era context. From the 16th to the 17th century in the northern provinces of the Low Countries and around Europe, there was a major shift in the religious landscape, which also affected material culture with regard to the use and aesthetics of church buildings, and of course, art production and patronage patterns. Dutch reforming sentiments were deeply shaped by concerns regarding uses of images, veneration of sacraments, saints, and abuses of the clergy. In the 1520s, grassroots dissent and dissatisfaction was soon reinforced by the first circulation of translations of Luther's ideas and then Zwinglian Reformed ideas. These were reinforced further by efforts of rhetorician guilds in the Dutch context. While Lutheran religious practice soon backed away from the most extreme iconoclastic positions and even permitted some use of art in church for moralizing functions or for decor, Zwinglian Reform ideas from Swiss cantons were strictly against emphasis on the sensory in worship. Focus should be solely on God via the biblical word. There was no place for art, and there were instances of organ lids, for instance, being nailed shut as well. This was all part of the Zwinglian Reform context. In the 1520s, we see early examples of proto-Anabaptist and Anabaptist aniconism and anti-clericalism in different regions around Europe. Karlstadt wrote his treatise with 33 points vehemently against image use in 1522. And Ludwig Heitzer also wrote heatedly in 1523 in support of reform efforts and in response to and support of the recent iconoclastic rioting there. In Zurich, followers of Zwingli, who would soon become the first Anabaptists, were engaging in debates to try and speed along image reform. Among the most significant of Swiss disputations on the subject was the second Zurich disputation from 26 to 28 of October 1523, which was devoted to the subject of image reform. As we see in this disputation, Zwingli and the soon-to-be Anabaptist followers were in fact in many ways in agreement on the image question, and the divisions between them ultimately came from matters of things like infant baptism and the speed of liturgical reform, where there could be no agreement. The first day of this disputation was dedicated to images, while the second and third were spent on the subject of the Eucharist. Zwingli and Leo Judd argued for liturgical reform alongside others, but as their approach came to be seen as too slow and insufficient, Conrad Grebel, who would emerge later as the leader of the first Swiss Anabaptists, raised concerns about the speed of reform and called for the theological trained radical reformer, who would eventually, though briefly, be an important Anabaptist leader, Balthasar Hubmaier, to speak. Hubmaier's writing on idolatry is more often concerned with the question of the Lord's Supper and the idolatry of treating the bread as the bread and host as Christ's actual flesh and blood. However, he offers some sharp words on the subject of images at this 1523 gathering. On the first day, Hubmaier explicitly condemns the presence of images in the church, suggesting that scriptural views on the matter make his position plain. On the second day, he returns to the subject near the end of the day's discussion, reiterating his rejection of images and citing scriptural commandments about graven images. However, he also goes on to indicate that while image use is wrong, since images are already present in churches, the procedure moving ahead should be carried out carefully. He does not call for violence or discord in their removal. He rather considers that scriptural analysis should be the guide for the process and should make it abundantly clear that congregations ought to remove their images. Important for Dutch developments, we see that prior to his arrival in the Low Countries, the Furrier turned evangelical Lutheran reformer and eventual Anabaptist leader Melchior Hoffman demonstrated his own adherence to iconoclastic views. In 1524, he was staying in Dorpat, where he preached against the use of images, among topics on which he felt there should be reform. This fostered the spread of iconoclastic sentiment, leading to an iconoclastic riot on the 10th of January, 1525, which prompted an attempt at Hoffman's arrest. We can also look at David Joris, back in the Low Countries, who would emerge as a spiritualist leader and shaper of pacifist Anabaptist thought, particularly between the fall of Munster Anabaptists and the rise of Menno Simons, Dirk Phillips, and Leonard Bowens as leaders of what would become Mennonite Anabaptism. He was also originally involved in incriminating acts of anti-sacramental defiance. As Waite has highlighted, Joris was arrested on May 21, 1528, when he harshly criticized image use and veneration of Mary. Waite notes, as a result of iconoclastic speech during the Ascension Day procession, Joris was arrested and imprisoned for 11 weeks. Court records indicate that he situated himself in front of the new church at around 10 a.m., the time that was common when people were passing by with the procession of Our Beloved Lady. And publicly, as if he were a preacher, he spoke to the crowd decrying their idolatry. Some insight into Joris's religious ideas of the period may be gleaned from the summary of one of the anti-clerical pamphlets presented during his trial on July 30. About the use of images in the church, Joris apparently had written, "The false hypocrites, monks, and priests have made us believe that images were the books of the unlearned, but the Spirit of the Lord says that they are snares to the falling of the unlearned and are tempters of their souls." End quote. It was in 1530 that Anabaptism began to spread through the Low Countries via Emden from contact with Melchior Hoffman. There, he baptized 300 people, and emissaries went out to spread the word further. Anabaptist ideas on imagery retained Zwinglian characteristics and mingled with the local Dutch reforming views, rejecting the presence of icons, statues of saints, and other objects in Catholic churches. As is well established already, after the growth and spread of Anabaptists in the Low Countries, this diverse movement quickly faced persecution for their unorthodox beliefs, like adult baptizing. This was most severe from Catholics in the Low Countries, but in other parts of Europe, this came from both Catholic and Protestant magistracy. They found pockets of toleration where they could survive more easily, but generally had to proceed with care and worship discreetly for fear of capture. Persecution increased leading up to 1535 after the rise of Anabaptist Munster and evidence of violent Anabaptist uprising elsewhere. Incidentally, in Munster, there are physical remains of the iconoclasm that happened there as the city capitulated from Catholicism to evangelicalism and then to Anabaptism. That's the image that you can see now on the slide, some of these objects that were smashed and defaced, often especially focusing on the face and hands of these statues. Unlike uprisings like those in Amsterdam, Bolsward, and Munster put civic powers further on edge as the movement remained a target of authorities well into the 1570s. Meanwhile, among Dutch Reformed contingents, matters reached a boiling point with the Great Iconoclasm of 1566. This was when mobs burst into churches and stripped the buildings of their artworks, statues of saints, and other finery. It was not long after this iconoclastic moment that the 80 Years' War broke out between the predominantly Reformed Dutch folk and the Catholic Habsburg forces. The Dutch wanted political and religious independence. In regions that became predominantly Protestant, the nature of art patronage changed drastically, as there was no longer a place for icons and altarpieces, a use within the church. This was at first a jolt for artists. The church was no longer their key patron. Meanwhile, social structures were also changing, and it was no longer only royalty and the most important clergy members who could afford to commission portraiture. The growing classes of successful merchants and tradespeople became patrons and collectors of art in their own right. While most art commissioned for churches had been altarpieces featuring saints, the Virgin and Child, Bible stories, and so forth, as the reform movement progressed, artists in turn scrambled to branch out into new genres, filling increasing demand for portraiture and for art to decorate people's homes. This offered the push for genres like landscape, cityscape, still life, household scenes, and other kinds of scenery to take on a life of their own. These became popular options alongside ongoing demand for history painting, including biblical and classical themes, which remained the most highly regarded genre. As the Dutch factions claimed cities for their cause, the Reformed leadership repurposed the ready-built Catholic church buildings for Reformed worship. They continued with more orderly or silent iconoclasm, removing art and whitewashing walls. They dismantled the high altars and set up pulpits in the center of the church space, reorienting the focus of the service toward the Bible and the sermon, and away from the historically important site of Catholic Mass. Mennonites, by contrast, had by this time been worshipping in secret for decades in makeshift meeting spaces, people's homes, outdoor locations, and even boats. A so-called Weetdoener was tasked every time with carefully spreading the news of the worship location to the congregants. There was, in short, no expectation among these Mennonites of access to the existing church infrastructure. In 1579, the Union of Utrecht took effect across several Dutch provinces, and this guaranteed freedom of conscience for all who wished to live and worship in these northern provinces. In 1581, with the Act of Abjuration, which did not recognize the Catholic Habsburg king, the de facto Dutch Republic was born, though it would only be formally recognized by Spanish Empire with the Treaty of Münster, marking the end of the 80 Years' War in 1648. Minority groups found significantly more security here than in other places in Europe, and different groups proceeded to build hidden churches. These were all limited by the physical rules imposed on them by the civic powers. Across minority confessions, early modern hidden churches shared some core characteristics, therefore. They had to be, they tended to be made of wood rather than stone, and they had to be hidden behind house fronts. They were also not permitted to have steeples, bells, or signs, and were generally meant simply to blend into the cityscape. They also tended to have sets of U-shaped balconies to accommodate more people in the limited architectural footprint of the building. To use some examples of Dutch Mennonite churches, you can see that the ways to blend in, logically enough, depended on the kind of location. And here I've got just a few different examples that are still extant here in the Netherlands. This one here you can see is a hidden church built on a big canal side street with large merchant houses. To fit it in this kind of space, we have often bigger sheds or spaces between the rows of houses in the canal area that are then converted into church spaces. In smaller towns, that would of course look out of place. So you have other ways of building in the church in the back side of the house or through a narrow passageway that you could reach through the clusters, the sort of caretaker's living area. And in even more rural regions and farming communities, we see an interesting kind of format, which is called a Kopf, Hals, Rumpf style. And that means head, neck, body, or something like that. And that really fit in with how farmers and different people in these areas had their houses set up. So in this case, in Ness and Ameland, you can see that the church building is the portion that looks like a barn at the back of this setup. While there were structural limitations, comparison of early modern Dutch churches that were hidden churches also illustrates that these buildings also could nonetheless be used to support the needs of these different theological groups that met there. For example, Catholic hidden churches continued to make use of art. And so, as Zander van Eck has shown, there remained a market for altarpieces and other art meant for hidden Catholic church interiors, even in the Dutch Republic. They continued to use the high altar and had their traditional processions and liturgies within these buildings. So here I've got a picture of the Single Kerk and of a hidden Catholic church, which is now a museum in Amsterdam. You can see how the Mennonite church has no art inside, whereas the Catholic church, they continue to have this revolving front altarpiece, which is set up in a very creative way so that it fits with kind of pulleys behind the wall there and works with the smaller hidden church construction format. Mennonite hidden churches tended to be built with emphasis on non-hierarchical format in which all members could sit in the round, and the preacher and church board were also not overly set apart from the congregation. The buildings were simply gathering places for the congregation to meet and to be the church together. To emphasize Mennonite ideas of community and accountability, they even called their churches Vermaningen, literally admonitions. These were spaces to consider the written and spiritual word and to be accountable to one another. Extant buildings and imagery show evidence that these spaces were even more aniconic than their Dutch Reformed counterparts. While the Dutch Reformed had removed religious art, soon elaborate text boards with Bible verses and also plaques and tombs and monuments celebrating important Dutch citizens, royalty, or military heroes took a prominent place in both old, repurposed Catholic church buildings and newly built Dutch Reformed churches. By the second half of the 17th century, the Dutch Reformed churches also incorporated painted organ wings, often featuring biblical history stories of Old Testament music making. This was the only place in the church where paintings and biblical stories were allowed to be present. A fine example of this is in the set of wings painted by Gerard de Laresse in Amsterdam's Westerkerk. Mennonite churches, by contrast, remained free of decor, text boards, and figurative art. Even the addition of organs took a century longer than the Dutch Reformed counterparts, and they never took up the step of including painted wings. The Dutch Republic saw a burgeoning new genre of Dutch Reformed interior painting and church cityscapes featuring these buildings, with celebrated practitioners, including the likes of Emmanuel de Witt and Sanderdam, examples of which you can see here. The Mennonites, Jan van der Heyden and Isaac van Nickelen, also painted views of Reformed hidden church exteriors and interiors, respectively. Jan van der Heyden did this in context of cityscapes, and van Nickelen was known for his specialism in this interior church genre scene, specializing in Reformed churches. So you can see this pragmatism in what artists picked to do and how religion played a role there or not. Artists specializing in this genre rarely painted minority groups' religious buildings. Exceptions include some buildings which were considered architecturally interesting or religious novelties. Most notably, Amsterdam's Jewish synagogues, for example, attracted tourists from around Europe, and so that also triggered interest from artists to paint these for interested buyers. Another good example is the Round Lutheran Church, which likewise was an architectural novelty and therefore attracted some attention. But that means that for the Mennonite context, aside from one painting from the late 18th century of the Zonneskerk in Amsterdam, we in fact have no Republic-era paintings of Mennonite hidden church buildings, much like we lack paintings of Remonstrant and other minority church group buildings. That being said, several artists did produce prints of minority groups' hidden church buildings for Amsterdam city descriptions and picture albums, including Mennonite spaces. These are typically paired with descriptions of the building and of those who used them. Thus, for instance, in one such example featuring the Amsterdam single kerk again, the Kerk bij het Lam, we get the memorable anecdote that follows. Here you can see the text both in Dutch and in French, and it recounts this context of the Mennonites who were so concerned about being sober and keeping things simple that they had these chandeliers that they painted so that the brass wouldn't glisten and distract people during the church service. Furthermore, Mennonite draftsman Cornelis Pronk and his student Hendrik de Winter, active in the 18th century, specialized in topographical illustration and also did some church illustration work, including some of the only illustrations of Mennonite church interiors for buildings that are now demolished. These give us a unique glimpse of what these spaces look like and reinforce the sense of simple, art-free worship spaces. I think that's especially the case with these illustrations of the Jan Jacobsgezinde Kerk in Amsterdam. Here you can see the church actually where Pronk himself was a member. So you can see that this artist painted, drew and illustrated all sorts of different church buildings around the region, but also was among the only ones to take care and illustrate his own church building, this Mennonite church, the Arke Noah. We'll return to Hendrik de Winter a little bit later and the reason for the drawing that's made here, but it's good to see that he does also illustrate worship practices within the church. What's interesting about this is that he was not the first to do this kind of illustration work featuring actual active practices. That was first carried out by Bernard and Picard in their foundational religious comparison texts, which include all sorts of descriptions of the different religions of the world, as well as all the different Protestant groups among these, and included very detailed illustrations of many different practices that were carried out by these groups. So in the case of the Mennonites, we see baptism scenes and the Lord's Supper and so forth happening in the church spaces. And that seems very similar to what Hendrik de Winter later does. While Mennonites firmly maintained an aniconic worship space, as I've already mentioned, art collection was prevalent for enjoyment in home life among nearly all Mennonite groups. In this, they were in keeping with their Reformed peers. John Calvin's writings firmly rejected imagery in the church but allowed explicitly for art at home, as it could be didactic and moralizing, or of course, a good source of enjoyment. Furthermore, in Christian tradition, much to do with nature was deeply tied to understanding of God and creation. Dutch Reformed viewed nature as God's book of revelation, also of value next to the Bible. And thus art themes to do with landscape or still life were imbued with these overtones. Later, this was paired with ideas of physical theology, which allowed that the scientific study of nature offered insights about God and theology. Thus, collecting both art and naturalia was a part of the erudite, genteel, and pious lifestyle, and many Mennonites too participated avidly in this. Many probate inventories and auction records demonstrate concretely Mennonite collecting practices, as do existing artworks for which the provenance can be traced back to the Mennonite owners. We can therefore get a sense of exactly what was in some people's houses and sometimes where they were situated. For instance, it's known that the avid art collector Philips de Flines, owned a series of allegorical Guzais by Gerard de Loressa, which graced his entryway in his Grand Canal home in Amsterdam. We also see in Halbrecken's biography of the artist Laurens van der Vinne that he actually commissioned illustrations of his whole botanical collection, and many of these artworks are preserved still in the Rijksmuseum today. So we get a good picture of what some of these collectors were interested in and what they were doing. Furthermore, portraits especially offer a first-hand look at individual Mennonites themselves in a context within which they have agency to determine with the artist precisely how they wish to be portrayed. Attributes could be used to indicate their family status, their professions, their collecting interests, and their piety. The well-known portrait of Cornelis Claes Anslo displays the Waterlander minister with his wife Eltje Schouten. The Bible is given a prominent place, taking up more than half of the scene, and as several scholars have noted, we also see a wick trimmer next to the candle, perhaps a reference to the Mennonite value of mutual accountability and admonition. While many themes and iconographies were widely known among Dutch audiences, much like we all understand how to interpret modern memes and emojis, I think it's also valid to consider insider jokes and references that were more specialized to particular networks. So, for instance, in the print of Anslo, again, we see there must have been wider interest in him as a well-respected minister, because this print would have then been available to wider collecting groups. He's posed in a fashion that's typical of a scholar or thinker in his study. But if you look closely, as Stephanie Dickey has pointed out, you can also see in the background on the right side, there's a nail in the wall. Just take a minute to look at that. That's called a spiker in Dutch, a nail. And the grote spiker, the big nail, was the nickname that people used for the Toren, the name of the Waterlander church where Anslo was a minister in Amsterdam. Sometimes we can trace family members over the years in these portraits as well, as we see in this example with David Leeuw. On the left, he's shown as a boy posed as a pilgrim in a painting by Govert Flinck. And later, we see him painted as a grown man with his family in a portrait by the Mennonite artist, who was in fact the son of the preacher-artist Lambert Jacobson we talked about before, Abraham van den Tempel. The image we see here on the right demonstrates changing tastes between generations as well. The parents adhere to simpler black dress, while the children wear more colorful clothes. Furthermore, the theme of family harmony ties the picture together, as all make music with each other, singing a religious hymn, the text of which you can actually see if you look closely at the music held by two of the daughters. Even the baby, wearing a bumper to avoid head injury, has bells on her rattle so that she can participate too. In the first half of the 17th century, we see, as some examples have shown already, that there's a preference for sober black dress and simpler poses, as with Frans Hal's pendant portraits of the well-to-do potash merchant Lucas de Klerk and his wife Fentje van Steenkiste, or the portrait of the Mennonite watchmaker Matthijs Jans Beukels and his wife Maria Bastians van Hout. Here we see that the watchmaker poses with a watch, indicating his profession and also perhaps the passage of time. Another striking painting features the Mennonite Beerens family in their kitchen, an unusual choice for a portrait, which usually is meant to feature people dressed in their Sunday best and showing off the best sides of their house and lifestyle. Here, we could assume that the values of working together are emphasized, as they all partake in kitchen tasks, except for the son who plays the cello. Here again, a reference to family harmony, literally, with use of a musical instrument. The scene also shows that the family valued their art collection. Whether or not they actually had paintings hung in their kitchen, in this painting portrait of them, they did choose to include these in the scene here. Meanwhile, in the second half of the century and on into the 18th, we see how the upper echelons of Mennonite merchant family networks increasingly embraced and showed off their identities as collectors, often posing in their country estates or fine canal side homes. We see here, for example, Agnes Bloch and her second husband, Sijbrand de Vlienis, at the country estate Vijverhof, where Bloch was an important patron of art and botanist too, hiring artists to illustrate her botanical samples, including the first, well, for example, she grew the first Dutch native-grown pineapple, and also earned herself the nickname Flora Batava, flower goddess of the Netherlands. Her husband was in his right an avid art collector too, so we see in this picture different references to all of these artistic and natural interests. In a portrait by Mennonite turned Remonstrant artist Michel van Musker, we see the family de Neufville, for instance, also prominently seated among collections of art and flower specimens. Again, in another portrait, the portrait of David van Mollem and his family, at a different country estate, Zijdeballen, which literally means silk bales, we see the family sitting together in this place that was founded based on their fortune made in the silk industry. Art and nature are again prominent, and yet we also see an indication of intergenerational moralizing. If you look at the older man, David, in the corner, he and his grandson are looking at a print of the story of the prodigal son. To be sure, Mennonite ministers at various points warned against worldliness out of concern for the souls of their congregants. This comes across very clearly in several confessional writings and devotional or didactic works, like Mennonite martyrology prefaces. You can see just a few examples here. From the concept of Cologne, we have this text. Furthermore, we have discussed our apprehensions concerning the growing inclination of the merchant class towards temporal greed and the vanity of ostentatious clothing, which imitate the world rather than displaying the humility of Christ. And because there are insidious creeping sins, and it is to be feared that they will lead many to destruction, although one can hardly prescribe for anyone how much business he should do or what he should wear, yet we desire that each of us would restrict his business activities and dress modestly. Indeed, that he might enlighten the world in all he does, and not attire himself like the world, after the manner of the discontented and the insatiable. For this reason, we have agreed that all who keep watch over the house of God should censure their members in all faithfulness and in the power of the scriptures. And in this way, each brother admonish the other with a fatherly heart, so that the admonition will be more tolerable. And then, in one of the prefaces to one of the 17th century martyrologies, we see the text, "Simplicity has turned into pomp and splendor. Material wealth has impoverished the soul. Outer dress has become rich and shiny, but the inner jewel has gone." And finally, in the 1685 Martyr's Mirror, text from Ben Bracht, we see a direct reference to some of these country estates. I should say that these estates, they became so well known, these clusters of them along the Vecht River and the Sparn River, they came to be known as Ministerhemmels or Mennonite heavens. So this was really a kind of known phenomenon. Ben Bracht writes, "Many glorify and praise God with their mouth, but show nevertheless, to the seduction of the simple, that the world is their dear friend, yea, lies nearest to their heart, since most of their works are directed to its service, that they may thereby partake of its glittering but deceptive reward. Numerous large, expensive, and ornamented houses, country seats of splendid architecture, provided with towers, parks magnificent as paradise, and other embellished pleasure grounds, indicate this worldliness in no small degree." So there were different leaders in the denominational life that were advocating for a more simple lifestyle. However, as Ruud Lamboer and Mary Sprunger have shown, in practice, those who were well off and embraced collecting culture were not actually firmly admonished or faced with church discipline on the basis of their wealth. This in contrast to those who were seen to behave immorally by way of things like drunkenness, sexual impropriety, violent behavior, sometimes marrying outside of the Mennonite denomination, or financial mismanagement and bankruptcy, which was interpreted as dishonesty to creditors. While church life did not include images, as we saw in the many examples before, it's important to note that in terms of collecting and the home, as well as artistic collaborations between Mennonites, the realm of illustrated devotional literature and identity-forming literature offers several important examples of co-religionists working together and imagery made by and for Mennonites, so one of these exceptions. Mennonite Jan Philipson Schrebalius' Lusthof des Gemoeds, for example, was first published in 1635, and it was a devotional book in which the protagonist, the wandering soul, journeyed through the stories of the Bible and met different characters along the way. As Piet Visser has shown, this went through a plethora of editions and was very popular not only among Mennonites, but also among others. Many of these different editions were illustrated as well. Imagery thus supported the didactic and devotional themes of the book, and it was an accepted part of religious life in this devotional reading context. And it was albeit centered on the bookshelf and home and not in the church, of course. At present, it's also been translated into German and English, and this book remains a popular book among, for example, the Amish in North America. Furthermore, Mennonites participated in production of edifying emblem books. There were a large number of Mennonite editors and publishers, and among those who worked on emblem books, there are several instances of collaboration. One example of these is Adrian Spinnaker's Leerzame Zinnebeelden, for which the author collaborated with co-religionist Vincent Laurens van der Winne, who produced the illustrations. Furthermore, the book was published by also a Van der Winne family member, so we see this whole network of Mennonites working together on these kinds of devotional, didactic writing publication projects. These sort of books featured an illustrated emblem, as well as Bible verses and an explication to show how these symbolic scenes were meant to be interpreted. And then, of course, we need to take a moment to think about the context of martyrology illustration. Of course, most denomination groups produced martyrologies to feature stories of their different people who had been persecuted or executed in the Reformation period. However, the Mennonite context produced a large number of these books, and they've retained an important spot in both Dutch and international visual culture, I would say, in a striking way. It's also particularly important because these were some of the few spaces where Mennonites found a way to navigate the telling of the story of the 16th century times as a way to avoid the narratives of uprisings in Munster and the Melchiorite streams, which they were very keen to differentiate themselves from. So while the initial editions of these martyrology volumes were not illustrated, they did have frontispieces which were illustrated or illustrated title pages, and these offered some of the first and only visual representations of 16th century Anabaptist executions, which were meant to be actually positive scenes and not polemical ones critiquing the group. But as I said before, the most famous of these books now is the second edition of Tiedemann Jans van Bracht's Martyr's Mirror. And that one really caught on because of the illustrations inside of it. It was actually a project brought together by a group of reformed entrepreneurs who thought that there would be a market for this very expensive luxury version of the original 1660 text. And while the editors are not Mennonite, you can see that the visual material is very, perhaps intentionally, carried out by Mennonite artists. The frontispiece is designed by Laurens Vincent van der Winne, who we've already heard about earlier today. And the interior scenes, of course, are illustrated by none other than Jan Loken, also from Mennonite milieu and involved in collegiate circles. Then moving later on towards more pietist circles of thinking. And it's important to note that while these images are quite a sort of memorable part of visual culture in Dutch context for Mennonite history, they are not actually altogether unique. So other kinds of martyrologies of the Reformed groups and Catholic groups made use of similar kinds of tropes and motifs, and then sometimes very literally. So you can see in this example how closely Jan Loken has borrowed the composition from a design that was probably done by Van den Echout for the Reformed martyrology by Van Heemstede. Nonetheless, these images have kind of found a place in the history of these publications, both in Dutch context and spreading further afield as the Martyr's Mirror was translated into German and English. While initially they were not translated with illustrations, later on some of these were brought back in and remained a part of that print history. Even in the Dutch context, we see how quickly the pictures became a part of the story of, or part of the visual culture of this book, in that there was a call not long after the publication of the 1685 book, where people really wanted a less expensive, smaller sized book that could be more practical for average Mennonites to have access to. And while the first edition of this book included no illustrations at all, and just the summaries of the stories, later editions, which came about several years later, Alta always did include these somewhat poor copies of the original Jan Luyken illustrations. You can see that they're not quite comparable in artistic quality, but they do carefully copy, also in reverse image, what Jan Luyken had designed. And then finally, I want to return to the role of these illustrations of ministers and how this played into some kinds of identity-forming publications. On a few occasions, we've already discussed the production of these portrait prints. And with regard to confessional affiliation in art, it's interesting to note that there are several examples of probate inventories, which include mention of Mennonite owners of prints and of print boards of Mennonite ministers. As Dickey and others have shown, such prints were collected of admired leaders and great thinkers, including spiritual ones. Lambour has also recently highlighted the collection of Mennonite minister prints owned by the clock and watchmaker turned bookkeeper, David Bramin. He was an avid print collector and therefore attracted the attention of German Lutheran travel writer Zacharias von Uffenbach, who stopped to admire his collection in the 18th century and described it in his travel journal. Furthermore, in 1743, 30 portraits featuring Mennonite ministers were published together by Amsterdam bookseller Cornelis de Witt. This series was titled A Collection of Images of Many of the Foremost Men and Teachers, Lehrer in this case, the preferred term for Mennonite preachers, who from the beginning of the Reformation and also in later times had taken on the office of preacher in the service of the Mennonite, Doopsgezind Christians. This publication is important because it spans 16th through 18th centuries and includes figures from across the different Mennonite splinter groups. As the title page clarifies, the portraits are all new copies of original portraits made into prints by skilled masters. What is not explicitly mentioned by de Witt is that most of the original portraits selected to be replicated here have ties back to Mennonite artists as well. Among the many examples are Meerveldt's portraits of de Ries and Gerrits, who were key Mennonite leaders and also then carried out by a very, very important Dutch Mennonite artist. Some portraits by Crispin van de Passe, the Savory portrait after the portrait by Bakker, and also this one that you can see here of Jamie Jacobs de Ring, a Waterlander preacher from Harlingen, which was produced by Lambert Jacobsen. The appended laudatory poems are also by respected writer Adrian Spinnaker, who we also just heard about in the context of the emblem book, Leer Samenzijnnebeelden. Very little is known about the bookseller and publisher de Witt, but the apologetical language he uses in his introduction suggests a strong empathy with the Mennonite faith and the leaders represented. He writes of his desire to commemorate a group of devout leaders from among the Doopsgezinden, and he emphasizes the role of prints and drawings to preserve and represent the characteristic traits and deeds of pious and godly men, suggesting he considers those included in the publication to be important and devout Christian leaders. In doing so, he situates the portraits within the tradition of print series of great or virtuous men, with a very particular Mennonite apologetical slant. In his foreword, he also cites Psalm 112, verse 6, which states that the righteous will be eternally remembered, and Hebrews 13, verse 7, an admonition to remember your leaders who spoke the word of God to you, consider the outcome of their way of life, and imitate their faith. These verses function as a leitmotif throughout the series, inscribed in the decorative plate by J.C. Phillips that surrounds each of the smaller portrait plates. The same images appear between 1743 and 1745 as illustrations in the last two volumes of a new edition of Zonist Mennonite minister Herman Schijn's Geschiedenis der Mennoniten, History of the Mennonites, which was edited and extended by fellow Zonist Gerard Matschoen and published by de Witt as well. The first volume includes 5 illustrations which depict worship services in different Mennonite hidden churches of the Republic era. The unillustrated original version of Schijn's history was published in 1711, drawing together a unified history of Mennonites and repudiating owners of, lost a page there, repudiating Mennonites who were involved in Münsterritism. In keeping with this theme, the church illustrations and portrait series likewise include many different branches of Mennonitism, suggesting a cohesive story of Mennonites, despite the many actual disagreements between the groups and the leaders. The compendium of portrait prints and the Schijn history are among the most image-rich in the long line of Mennonite apologetical publications from the Republic, alongside books like The Martyr's Mirror. This artwork, in contrast to other bodies of polemical literature, a topic which I can't get into very much today, because it would be a whole other long talk, this artwork of including these martyr images and models of faithfulness in the format of minister portraits offered a contrasting set of imagery to tell the Mennonite story, which stood in contrast to the many different books and illustrations that featured Mennonites in the Anabaptist 16th century as sort of radical heretics and dissenters, a series of publications that circulated widely throughout the 17th century and beyond. I think finally, it's important to point out some of these Dutch images of devotional leaders and of these churches and of the martyr prints, because it's among these that we get images that actually are probably familiar beyond the Dutch context to some of us today still. So there's been many contexts where there have been some Mennonites involved in art production, but as we think about what has kind of stuck in what you might call a Mennonite visual culture more broadly, certainly the portraits of Menno that we use now in some of our different sorts of posters and things come from the Dutch Republic. Likewise, scenes like the classic Dirk Willems being pulled from the ice remain alive and well in our tradition. And we see, for example, the recent statue put up at the Mennonite Heritage Village in Winnipeg based precisely on this Dutch print from 1685. So to conclude, the study of Dutch visual culture literally offers us a glimpse of early modern Dutch Mennonite life. We see Mennonite individuals and families portrayed. We see artworks representing their homes and their churches, and we can see artworks that we know from probate inventories and other sources were actually a part of their art collections. We can see, in a sense, how they wished to present themselves to the world. We have seen several examples of intra-Mennonite networks and artists who were Mennonites working on subject matter linked to their own religious heritage. But we have also looked at substantial evidence that shows that Mennonites could hold their own within the broader art marketplace. Religious kinship networks provided important support for artists' careers, but artists also worked collaboratively and enjoyed success that transcended conventional boundaries of artists and patrons. Even when production of art by Mennonites itself is not distinctly Mennonite in some way, it's nonetheless important to study this output and highlight the scope of Mennonite presence in the art marketplace, because this information helps to adjust the historiographical picture of Mennonite artistic involvement within Mennonite history writing that we do now, and balances out the picture of denominationally diverse Dutch art world within the art historical scholarship on artistic production, which has so far specialized more on looking at Reformed and Catholic context. The case study of Dutch Mennonites offer many examples that show that daily life was, for many, deeply enmeshed with art, and could nevertheless be altogether pious and in keeping with the norms of most of the Mennonite churches at that time. Art was a valued part of home life in most cases, and even figured in devotional life in the context of didactic religious devotional imagery, like emblem books, or in identity forming and celebratory collections of illustration and written works. By looking at a variety of case studies and examples, both commonalities and divergences in Mennonite positions on art become evident, and also allow us to consider Mennonite beliefs on art and faith in comparison to those of their Dutch neighbors of other creeds. Furthermore, it's my hope that this close study of the Dutch context will also offer a jumping-off point for our own comparisons of contexts of Mennonite involvement in cultural life in other regions and in other time periods. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Schroeder-van at Schip. It was Incredible presentation. The images were so rich, and I know that we'll have questions that we'd like to ask. The first question has to do with the Martyr's Mirror, and I will mention that we have a copy of that on display in our library currently as a part of this emphasis that we have going on. So the question is the Martyr's Mirror still popularly read among Mennonites today?
Thank you for that question. I would say it's kind of like a household name in many Mennonite circles. So there's a sense, I think, in many cases that people will have heard of it before, or it's perhaps on the grandma's bookshelf. And it depends also on the kind of Mennonite context. So there's a very different situation in Old Order Mennonite colonies or in Amish contexts as opposed to in urban communities. Yeah, so that's quite diverse, I'd say. And there's a very good book about that, actually, by David Weaver Zurcher, which traces the social history of that book from the earliest different martyrology stories through to the present, and how that book continues to live on, both the stories themselves and also that volume as a material object. So some of the images that we pluck out and use in other places, or just know about, even if we haven't read all the stories inside.
Thank you so much. I wonder if we have any questions from the room. I do see another from Zoom, and that question is, this is fascinating. How did Nina get interested in this topic? So could you tell us more about your story?
Oh, good question. I guess, well, I myself grew up in a Mennonite context in Winnipeg, where there's a lot of this kind of urban liberal setting, you could say. And I always liked to make art. And as I grew older, my grandfather did a fair bit of research on Mennonite history. And he told us this story about this artist called Balthazar Denner, who was an 18th century portrait artist and son of a Mennonite minister in Hamburg, Altona. So once I got a bit older, I thought, what could I study? What would be interesting? And then I started reading more about Balthazar Denner. And as I read about him, I realized that the sort of century ahead of him, the 17th century, in the Dutch context instead of Germany, had just dozens and dozens and dozens of Mennonite artists. So that was the beginning of that path towards this subject area.
Thank you for sharing. It's always fascinating to hear how someone got involved in a subject that they are now spending a lifetime studying. Mm-hmm. I had a question related to the admonitions against worldliness that you talked about in your presentation. I wanted to hear just a little bit more about how and to what degree did that affect the art, some of the art that Mennonites created?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting balancing act, because we have all sorts of different written texts that ministers wrote or had in sermons warning against worldliness. And it was a concern that, in fact, for example, in martyrologies, that these prefaces would state that this elaborate lifestyle of the present time was in fact more dangerous for the soul than the 16th century of persecution, where the physical body was in danger, because then your eternal soul was fine. Whereas this time period of potential greed and finery was in fact a whole other kind of dangerous. At the same time, we have a sense that there were no real instances of banning or punishment for this kind of lifestyle, just these warnings. And alongside that, we also get different satire works which do poke fun at this perceived hypocrisy of Mennonites who are claiming this sober and simple lifestyle, at the same time that it's clearly not true that they're living very simply. So one great example of that is this poem by Peter Longendijk. It's called, it's a poem about, he describes a group of Amish folks who are being helped by the Dutch to escape persecution in Switzerland in the early 1700s. And they come into town on these boats. And he describes how these refugees are just shocked and appalled to see how their co-religionists here have all these wigs on and all these artworks in their homes and fancy vases and things. And so this Dutch writer, who himself is from a fairly well-to-do family, is poking fun at his own Mennonite peers who, on the one hand, are so keen to help and offer funds for the poor chest and take care of those who need help, but also are clearly living in these very, some could say, worldly lifestyles.
Another question, this person says, illuminating presentation, And could you say that Mennonite attitudes toward culture and society were able to soak into the broader Dutch culture, shaping approaches to the arts?
I think that's been an interesting turn in several veins of Mennonite cultural studies lately. The idea that Mennonites weren't simply assimilating and therefore participating, but were in fact a part of that fabric of the society. So, so they're simply a part of the developments in art at a time when there were huge strides being made for new genres and art styles and just this flourishing art marketplace. I'd say in most cases, the kind of specializations that artists had were again meant to appeal to the broadest possible audience. So you couldn't say that Mennonite artists are painting in a very, very Mennonite way when they paint a still life if they're using tropes that everyone would understand as vanitas themes or as symbols about the brevity of life. That was not purely Mennonite, but they did, like everyone else, know how those themes worked as artists.
Another question. I'm wondering how many people in an average household of the time would be able to actually read the books, or did one or two read to the family?
I don't know the precise details on literacy rates, but in the Dutch context, it was quite a high literacy rate at that time. So there's also commentary, even from early on in the early modern period, that Anabaptists had particularly high literacy rates because of the emphasis on reading the biblical text. So if there's so much need for going back to these sources, then parents were very keen to teach their children to read, and there was a structure for making sure that happened. Also Sunday school, where people would learn these stories, learn this material. So not everyone could read, of course, but I'd say that the literacy was reasonably high in the Dutch Republic. Yeah.
Thank you, that's helpful. Question in the room.
So I was intrigued by your commentary on the picture of the family where even the baby had bells on the rattles so that they could join in and participate in the worship.
Yeah.
So did you get a sense that the intergenerational worship is what's being conveyed, or the family harmony, or because I know in many Mennonite contexts, shared music within the family still continues, and so I'm just wondering whether that you see that as representative of sort of intergenerational sharing of worship and music.
I'd say that was a very favored metaphor for family portraiture. They wanted to emphasize the idea of family harmony, literally. So this wasn't just in Mennonite portraits, but I do think that this portrait is quite cute in the way that the artist works it into every single character of this scene. Even the dog has bells on as well. You can see it's very carefully thought out. So I'd say in this case it's not distinctly Mennonite, but we do see then a particular family choosing to show themselves in that way.
Thank you very much. Question?
I'm interested in the whole history and concept of iconoclasm. And I noticed that Philip Jenkins is just in the process of publishing a new book on iconoclasm in the East, the Orthodox. So we know about, the Protestant Reformation, and now he's talking about this. And you mentioned some in Europe as well. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are about, what is it a purely theological impulse that creates that compels people to destroy, or is there some psychological pathology in that kind of movement, in that impulse?
Yeah, I think that there's a huge body of literature on Reformation iconoclasm. Some of it's focused on the German context and others on the Dutch and Low Countries. But what I find always striking about it is that it's often proposed as something that's meant to be reforming. It's meant to be very seriously taking matters into these mobs' own hands to clear these churches of artworks that were deemed to be idolatrous. But there's some interesting studies that show that so often there were these sort of sites for iconoclasm which were focused in on things like, again, the face or the hands or the parts of these statues that were considered to be the active or miraculous parts in these church buildings. So even as the people doing the iconoclasm were saying they didn't believe these statues had any value, the way that they attacked these things was somehow in a personified way. So it's not totally logical or linear in how those processes happened, I think.
Thank you.
Let me take another question from online, and that is, can you say a bit more about Magdalena Redekop's book about Canadian Mennonite artists and authors?
Yeah, it's a fantastic book. She's looking at her background is as a literary critic and in the field of literature. So I think that's how she most strongly approaches the topic. But she's looking at this, what she calls a Mennonite renaissance in art centered around Manitoba in the last few decades or generations in Canada. And she explores a lot of this artwork and literature and music produced in Mennonite milieu here in Canada. And I think it's a very interesting comparison point because we see in, for example, books like Miriam Taves's Complicated Kindness or Women Talking, all these ones that are quite popular right now. It is definitely writing that is about Mennonites by somebody who is sort of on the peripheries of this Mennonite world and very well versed in it. And then by contrast, in the Dutch context, we see a lot of Mennonite authors and writers and artists who are doing art but are not at all doing it about Mennonite themes. So I think she begins to ask those questions about what is Mennonite art versus what is art made by Mennonites. And that's part of these questions that come up there, as well as in these different conferences about Mennonites writing that have been popular in the last years.
Thank you. That's one other question in the room.
Yeah, kind of picking up on what you were just talking about, that distinction. Given the traditional emphases that you mentioned, the threefold humility and simplicity and biblical injunction against graven images, how did the Mennonite artists themselves, if you have access to their own self-reflections, how did they reflect on the practice, on their production of art? Did they talk about it as a vocation or just merely as an occupation? I wonder if they sensed that there was a continuity between their creativity and the creativity of God, or if this was a way to make a living and they happen to be good at it, right?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think first it's nice to take a step back and think about the big shift that happened in general in the Renaissance times with regard to how artists were viewing the profession. So prior to that, there was a sense that art making was kind of a craft or a skill that was useful for example, decorating a church or for different kinds of places around town. But with the Renaissance and this idea of, you get this growing idea of talent and of the artist's skill and of creativity and of mimicking other artists or ideas. So there's a much more a growing sense of pride in the work. And I think for the Dutch artists who were involved in this, it's a similar sense of practical skill. So you have to take apprenticeship with different artists and learn how to grind the pigments and mix the oil in and make the paint and learn how to do all the technical side of things. But there's also a sense of studying the master, learning from the master, becoming a master. So there was a lot of a mix of talent versus skill versus putting bread on the table. All these things were important. I think with the Reformation context and these groups that were very anachronistic, we also see some examples of concern about the artist's trade in a time when people had to switch from being artists who were making things for churches. So for example, I think Gary Waits highlighted very nicely the work about David Joris as a glass painter. He was this 16th century religious reformer eventually who was very concerned about image use. So we see then this period when he's just stopping with painting glass art for churches and focusing on this reform work. And by contrast, later in his career, he again takes up his artist tools to illustrate some of his own theological works, creating these very elaborate symbolic images to highlight his own views. So it's complicated, but the spaces for making art are shaped by religious conviction and by changing social perspectives about what the artist is.
Thank you. We have one more question online, and I'll invite if there's any final questions to go ahead and type them in, or I'll look for your hand in a moment. This participant said, I was interested in the organs in the churches and that there could be some paintings on them. Did I understand that this was in Mennonite churches? What about church music? Any restrictions on musical styles, sort of a musical iconoclasm? I realize that's not your field, but you might know.
Yeah, the organs, I talked about organs being nailed shut. There were some examples of that in Swiss context, for example, and elsewhere in these initial years. They wanted to get rid of the sensory things in worship, really kind of lock that away. And in the Dutch context, when they started building some purpose-built new Protestant churches, they didn't put in organs. They omitted that for a while. There was also, in the Reformed context, the importance of metrical psalms. So instead of harmony or distracting sensual music, you'd have very simple unison psalms set to rhythms that aren't necessarily the most appealing. It's meant to focus on the text, to focus on the words there. In the Mennonite setting, we have kind of a mix. There's a lot of music that's based on martyrology songs, for example, and unique, distinct Mennonite songs that were put into hymn books. Also, for example, Karl van Mander, the artist, also wrote a variety of books of poetry that some of the old Flemish churches used as their hymnals. So we see a whole variety of musical traditions. But in the churches themselves, the Mennonites didn't have organs for almost a century, longer than most Dutch Reformed churches. They started putting those in the 17th century, but the Mennonites mostly waited until the late 18th to install organs. And they never included painted wings. So you'll see some kind of decorative wood carving sometimes, but none of this biblical history painting in the church for the Mennonites.
Thank you. Any final questions? Then I'd like you to join me again in thanking our lecturer for her name. Dr. Schroeder-van at Schip, what a fascinating presentation, and we thank you for your responses to our questions as well as the images and the content that you shared. I would like to invite you all to our next lecture from ACBAS, and that is the Rollick Lecture on September 16th, 2024, that will focus on Baptist studies. More details to come. So thank you so much. Many blessings to you all. We're finished.